Photography has always been my passion. I'd always wanted to do it full time, and a few years ago I made the leap and quit my 9-to-5 job. It was scary at first. I didn't know if I could make enough money. There were some months early on where I actually didn't make enough, but eventually things picked up, and I have never looked back. One of my most profitable endeavors has been nature photography. Landscapes, wildlife, really anything interesting that I can find. A few times per year, I go on a week-long trek in the wilderness and just take as many pictures as I can, usually thousands. Out of them, I'm usually able to get a few hundred shots that are just fantastic. I make money by licensing them to businesses, websites, or for film and television. On one of these trips, something happened that I will never forget. I had planned a solo trek in the forests of Washington State. There's a spot that I heard of which is supposed to have some of the most incredible landscapes in the world. Access to this spot was supposed to be incredibly difficult. It would be a 3-day hike in and out through some pretty rugged land. There was no vehicle access at all. That was okay though, because I didn't mind a challenge. If it was easy, then everyone would do it and my work would not be as special. I was stunned by the beauty of the scenery as I hiked in. It seemed that around every corner there was a postcard-worthy shot. Rolling hills, waterfalls, and I even saw a full-grown moose, the first I'd ever seen. I stopped to set up camp as the sun started to dip below the horizon. My first memory card was already filled with some great pictures. The next 2 days were similar. Things were going great. There was not a sound to be heard other than the wind rustling in the trees and the occasional bird's song. I was feeling very alone. Not many people trekked this far in, and there was something eerie about it. I realized that I was taking a risk, and it would have made sense to go with a partner, but I didn't know anybody who was willing to take a week off work to walk 6 days straight. It was nearing dusk. I had already set up my camp for the night, and I was doing some exploring around my site, hoping to get a few more good shots before calling it a night. That was when I heard something. It sounded like footsteps. At first, I was sure it was a deer, but as I followed the noise, I changed my mind. Deer are very delicate and deliberate with every step. They place their hooves straight down in order to minimize noise and avoid attention from predators. This sound was more of a constant trudge, like a person was walking, dragging their toes with every step. The noise became louder as I continued to follow, until I saw something through the thick bush that shocked and terrified me. There was a woman walking slowly through the forest. She was older, probably in her 60s. She wore a pristine white gown and high heel shoes. Her hair was done up as if she were going to the Oscars. Her makeup was also done for the occasion. I was further confused because she didn't have any backpack or equipment. Just a white purse that matched her dress, which was dragging behind her as she walked. It would seem sensible that I should try to help her, but for some reason, that didn't seem right. Something about her made me think that she was exactly where she wanted to be, like she belonged in the forest. I know that doesn't make any sense, but that's the feeling that I had at the time. There was a sense of tranquility radiating from this woman. I stood and stared for several minutes before she disappeared into the distance. Several more minutes, and the sound of her footsteps faded into nothingness. When the sun was almost gone, I used the last few minutes of light to walk back to my campsite. As you may have guessed, I stayed awake by the fire all night. I sat there for hours, poking and prodding the smoldering logs, and thought about what I had seen. Part of me was expecting to see the woman again, but that didn't happen. I never saw or heard from her again. When morning came, I began the walk out. My mind was racing as I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation for what I'd seen. There was no way to get to that spot without doing the 3-day hike that I had done. To do it in high heels without food and water would be near impossible. I may never be able to explain what I saw, or why I didn't approach her. All I can say is that I really wish I'd taken a picture. This happened a few years ago when I was 22 years old. I live in a beautiful part of the country. I prefer not to say exactly where, but you should know that there are a lot of forested areas. When I was growing up, I would often go camping in the vast expanses of rugged wilderness that surrounded my home. I was in the Boy Scouts from a young age, so I think it's fair to say that I'm experienced when it comes to the outdoors. It had been a few years since I graduated from high school, but I was still close with several of my friends from those days. Jim and Andrew were my best friends at the time. They still are, actually. Jim was in the Boy Scouts with me, and he shared my love for the outdoors. Andrew, on the other hand, is more of a city guy. He's lots of fun, though, so we try to drag him out whenever we can. The three of us decided to go on a camping trip for a weekend in the late summer, probably the first or second week of September, at least a few weeks before the leaves started to fall from the trees. It was still warm enough that we didn't need to bring much. We just used my old tent and a few blankets. On Saturday morning, we set off in Jim's truck, with no specific idea of where we were going to set up. Like I said, I'd been camping in this area for most of my life, so I was fairly comfortable with winging it. It's more fun that way anyway. At around 11 a.m., we found a great campsite. It was close enough to the road that we were able to drive the truck all the way in. It was a rough ride to get in, though, a lot of bumps from rocks and tree roots. Jim's truck had four-wheel drive, though, so it wasn't that big of a deal. That was good, because Andrew doesn't like to sleep on the ground. He would take the back seat of the truck, while Jim and I would sleep in the tent. We spent a few hours setting up camp. I set up the tent and did some other stuff. Andrew gathered firewood, and Jim built a pretty impressive table out of logs and a piece of old plywood that we found lying around. His Boy Scout credentials were up there with the best of them. After all that was done, we decided to go for a hike and explore the area. It was about 2 or 3 p.m. when we started walking. Not a whole lot happened on our hike. We checked out the area and found a hidden lake. The shore was pretty marshy though, so we didn't go in. One thing did catch our attention though. We saw what looked like fresh footprints that didn't belong to any of us. The location was quite remote, so we were not expecting to see anyone else. It was public land though, so there was no guarantee that there wouldn't be others out there. When we got back to our campsite, however, I saw something that made my jaw drop. There was a large knife stuck into the middle of Jim's table. It was a hunting knife with a wood handle and a piece of yellow tape wrapped around it. "Hey Jim, is that your knife?" I said, pointing at it. When I looked at him, his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He was as terrified as I'd ever seen him. Someone was there while we were away. Not only that, but whoever it was seemed to have bad intentions. Our next move was pretty obvious. We got into the truck, not even bothering to take down camp. Jim started the engine, but as soon as we started moving, another problem arose. The tires were flat. I got out to check, and it was clear that they had been intentionally slashed, probably with the knife that was jammed into our table. We left the truck and all of our gear and started running. It had been about a 25-minute drive from the main road, so we estimated roughly double that on foot. As we sprinted through the forest, time seemed to stand still. I would look back every now and then, but never saw anyone chasing us. We never slowed down. It's amazing what adrenaline can do, and we eventually made it to the main road. As luck would have it, there was a truck coming. Andrew flagged it down and told the driver our story. He was happy to help, and we jumped into the back. A tremendous feeling of relief engulfed my body as the truck started to move. Just then, I looked to the side of the road, and I could see a dark figure standing on the bush line. I couldn't see his face because he was wearing a large hooded sweatshirt, but he was holding a knife. The knife that I saw at our campsite. When I was younger, probably 12 or 13, my best friend's name was Ethan. He would go to camp every summer for 2 weeks. It was always the most boring part of the summer for me because Ethan and I would spend most of our time together during the months that we were off from school. That's why I begged my parents to let me go to camp with him one summer. Money was tight in my family, so it was a tough sell, but my parents eventually decided that it would be a good experience for me, so they agreed. We set off early on a Saturday morning. Ethan's parents agreed to take me since they were going to drop Ethan off anyway. I was thrilled to be joining my friend at camp for once. He had told me many stories over the last few years, and I was finally going to get to experience what, up until then, I had only heard about. To be honest though, I was a little nervous. I had never really been out of the city for more than a night or two, and I wasn't sure if I could handle it. When we arrived, there were several log cabins scattered around a clearing in the forest, and one large cabin that seemed to be the mess hall and office for the head counselor. It was a very picturesque scene, with giant trees, bubbling brooks, and fresh air. We were really in the middle of nowhere, it seemed. When we arrived at the camp, we were greeted by a few of the counselors. They were friendly enough, and they were only a few years older than Ethan and I. We were about 12, and they were about 17 or 18. It does seem like an accident waiting to happen, just having a bunch of kids out there in the wilderness. But people have been doing it for generations, so maybe a little independence isn't the worst thing. We spent the next few days getting oriented and doing some basic stuff. Playing games, swimming and canoeing in a nearby lake. Just the usual summer camp stuff. I was catching on quickly, and therefore my previous concerns had disappeared. After the first week in the camp, we set out on a hiking trip that would last for 2 whole nights. We would sleep under the stars, and really have a chance to put our skills to the test. As we made our way through the forest, the counselors told us stories of their time at the camp. They also told us of an old legend that was passed on through the years. Apparently there used to be a prison not far from there, and a long time ago, one of the prisoners escaped, one of the counselors told me. He was a seriously deranged psychopath. I won't get into the details of what they say he did. You will have to take my word for it that it is disturbing. On a previous escape attempt, this criminal lost one of his hands trying to scale a barbed wire fence, so he had a wooden hand on one side. After he escaped, he hid out in these forests, trying to live off the land. He was never found, and nobody heard from him again. But some people have reported sightings as recently as the last few years. However, it's incredibly unlikely because by then, this guy would have been in his 90s, living off of grubs and worms in the forest by himself, with one hand. I was a skeptical person, so my initial thought was that it was just a made-up story that the counselors would tell to scare the campers. Ethan, however, seemed to believe it, although we both agreed that there was no way this guy was still out there. We eventually stopped for the night and set up camp. It was late by then, so everyone went straight to sleep. Well, everyone except Ethan and I. As soon as I laid down my head, I heard Ethan whisper in my ear, "Hey man, get up. I want to check something out." I slipped out of my sleeping bag and we snuck out of the campsite. "Dude, what's going on?" I grumbled. "I saw something a while back. There was some kind of cabin. I saw it through the trees," he explained. Our flashlights were hardly useful in the thick bush. They only lit up a few feet ahead of us as we trudged through the tree branches and over fallen logs. My mind was fixated on the story that our counselor had told us about the escaped prisoner who lived in these forests. It was a creepy feeling to imagine him out there all alone. The bush seemed endless until we reached a clearing. The glow of our flashlights burst when they reached the opening. A blanket of light fell upon an old shack which stood in front of us. Ethan and I looked at each other and exchanged excited looks. We weren't scared, just curious. The shack was clearly uninhabited, so we weren't worried about trespassing. The windows were all broken. The front door was hanging from a single hinge, and there was a large hole in the sparsely shingled roof. When Ethan and I walked through the front door, our jaws dropped. It was an absolute mess, that much was expected, but what really struck us was the walls. They were all carved up with some kind of symbols or creepy drawings. I don't even know what they were, but they were incredibly unsettling. Like some kind of ritual had taken place there. Although it was creepy, we didn't sense any danger, and our curiosity was still begging us to keep investigating. Ethan went to check out the other room, while I stayed to examine the etchings on the far wall. I was fixated on the mediocre artwork when I heard Ethan whisper, "Dude, get in here." I walked over to him, and his face was white as a ghost. He was pointing at something on the floor. When I finally got close enough to see it, my stomach sank. There was a wooden hand just laying in the middle of the room. With that, Ethan and I had seen enough. We bolted out of there and quickly made our way back to the safety of our campsite. We crawled into our sleeping bags, where we laid wide awake until the sun greeted us in the morning. We never told anyone what we saw that night. Part of me thinks it was an elaborate prank by the counselors. Like they set up the shack to look all scary, then told us the story and led us past it, hoping that a few of the more curious campers would find it and get scared. However, the more I think about it, I don't think that's what happened. It's too far-fetched, too elaborate. Besides, they never got to witness our reaction, so where's the fun? I believe that we stumbled upon the hideout of an escaped murderer that night, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. This happened almost 20 years ago. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. My friends Jess, Andrew, Austin, and I planned to escape the city and spend a few days in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but nature. We packed our bags, loaded up the car, and set off on our adventure. Our destination was a state park in the central Michigan area, so we expected lush forest, and we were not disappointed. We parked our car near the visitors center and started hiking in. It wasn't far, but the terrain was rugged, and the forest was thick. It was 2 in the afternoon, but the foliage managed to block out most of the sun on the trail. The hike would be impossible in the dark, even with a decent flashlight. After a couple of hours, we found a decent spot right next to a lake. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and shared stories around the campfire. The stars were out in full force, and the night sky was breathtakingly beautiful. It was the perfect start to our trip. The next day, we went on a hike and explored the nearby trails. We found another beautiful lake, and spent the afternoon swimming in the crystal clear water. We returned to the campsite, cooked up some dinner, and enjoyed the night sky again. But something strange happened that night. We were sitting around the campfire, and we noticed a light in the distance. We couldn't quite make out what it was, but it seemed to be coming from across the lake. We hadn't seen another person yet, so it was surprising to see another campfire so close. We were curious, so we decided to investigate. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way towards the lake. As we got closer, we saw that the light was coming from a campfire on the other side of the lake. We were relieved, because it seemed to be just another group of campers, so we went back to our fire. But before we turned around, we saw something that made our blood run cold. There, floating in the lake, was a body. We stood there in horror as it floated closer to the shore. It was a woman, and she was clearly dead. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the night sky. We were horrified and couldn't believe what we were seeing. Austin was trembling, and he said, "Come on, we need to get her out of the water." "No, are you crazy?" Jess snapped. "We can't touch her. That'll contaminate the evidence. Don't you watch TV?" Austin backed off like a frightened turtle when we all agreed with Jess. But if we weren't going to do that, then what could we do? We quickly realized that we were in the middle of nowhere, and there was no cell phone service. We couldn't just hike out in the middle of the night. Even more terrifying was that this could very well be a murder, and if it was, that would mean that the killer is out there. As soon as I realized that, I put out the fire and buried the coals under at least a foot of dirt. We couldn't risk being seen. The next time I looked across the lake, the light was gone. Whoever was over there decided to put their fire out as well. We didn't sleep that night, just sat up on guard. Every sound made us jump, and every shadow made us nervous. We took turns keeping watch, but nothing happened. In the morning, the body was still there. Somehow it was even more terrifying now that the moon's light was replaced by the sun. It seemed more real. In the night, it was more like a bad dream. But in the morning, reality was impossible to ignore. We didn't waste any time, and we hiked out. Then we went to the nearest ranger station to report what we had seen. The police were called in to investigate. They searched the lake, and sure enough, they found the lifeless body of a 24-year-old woman who had disappeared days before. They questioned each of us, trying to piece together what had happened, but the evidence was confusing, and no one had seen or heard anything that could lead to the killer. We told them about the campfire we had seen on the other side of the lake, but the rangers' records showed that nobody else was in the area at the time. We insisted that we'd seen another group. It seemed of the utmost importance that they be interviewed as well, but they were never found. In fact, I'm not even sure that the police believed that they existed. Weeks passed, and the police were never able to find the killer. The case went cold, but none of us ever forgot what happened. We were all changed by what we had seen, and our once close-knit group of friends slowly drifted apart. To this day, I still think about that night and the image of the woman's eyes staring blankly into the night sky. I wonder who could have committed such a heinous act. We were all just a group of innocent campers in the wrong place at the wrong time. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder if the killer is still out there, watching and waiting for the next victim. I went on a solo camping trip in the mountains of North Carolina. There was a remote trail that I'd wanted to hike for a while, and I eventually did it. It would be a 3-day hike in, and I would spend 2 nights on the trail. I was excited for the adventure and the chance to escape the city for a while. The first day was great. I only saw one other hiker the entire time, but we passed by each other with little more than a nod. I took in the beauty of the mountains and enjoyed the peace and quiet. At around dusk, I found a spot to spend the night. It was just off the trail in a small clearing. It was an established site with a neat fire pit already arranged. I set up camp, ate my dinner, and then I went to sleep. I never sleep through the whole night when I'm in my tent. I always wake up at least 4 or 5 times throughout the night. When I woke up one time, I could see a shadow moving around my site. It was definitely a human. I didn't move, and eventually he went away. I didn't fall back asleep that time. My mind raced through the possibilities of who it could be and why they were at my campsite. The next morning I got up early and ate breakfast. I continued walking, but I was scared because I didn't know who was there last night. At around noon, I saw a man on the trail in front of me. I was ready to say hi, but then he disappeared off into the bush. I was confused and didn't want to go past him on the trail. It might have been a trap. I yelled hello, but there was no reply. I decided to take my chances, and I walked past. When I got to the spot where I'd seen the man, someone lunged at me from behind a tree. He was scary looking, with dirty clothes and wild eyes. I managed to fight him off, and I ran as fast as I could. I reported the attack, and they sent out a search party, but they never found the man. The scariest thing is that another hiker reported being attacked as well. The man was never found, dead or alive. Even after I left the mountain, I couldn't shake a feeling of fear and vulnerability that settled in the pit of my stomach. The beauty of the mountain was nothing compared to the danger that lurked in the shadows. I left, but the memory of that hike stayed with me, a constant reminder of the fear I had felt in that remote trail. I never went camping alone again, and I never set foot on that trail again either. As I returned to my daily life, the memory of the hike continued to haunt me. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the image of his wild eyes and dirty clothes burned into my memory. I couldn't go back to the mountains, and I couldn't enjoy the beauty of nature without thinking of that man. I started to do some research on the trail and the attack. I talked to other hikers who had been on the trail, and many of them had similar stories. They had seen a man in the shadows, watching as he disappeared into the bushes. Many of them had reported strange noises in the night, and some even reported missing gear. With all those other accounts, it's incredible that the man has not been caught yet. It's like he's a ghost, always present, but rarely seen. I went camping with my cousins Randall and Courtney. We used to go every year with our parents, but now that we're grown, it's been a few years since our last trip. We decided to head to a national park where we lived. It's known for its rugged terrain and seclusion. The hike was a grueling 3 hours, but as we trudged deeper into the woods, we didn't encounter a single other person. As we set up camp, the sun was just beginning to set. We sat around the fire roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was very peaceful and serene, and for a moment, I forgot all about the stresses of everyday life. But that peace was broken by a sudden noise in the distance. It sounded like somebody pounding on a tree. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "What was that?" Randall asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it might be a bear," I said. We talked about it for a few minutes, and then I decided to check it out. I was the most experienced outdoorsman of the group. I was a camp counselor in the past and had wildlife training. I grabbed the best flashlight and headed towards the noise. I didn't turn on the light right away because the moonlight was still strong. I wanted to be sure before I potentially scared off whatever the animal was. I cautiously made my way towards the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I saw a figure standing in the woods. It was hard to see clearly, but I was pretty sure that it was a man. His back was facing me. I hid behind a tree in case he turned around. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but eventually, the figure disappeared into the woods. I made my way back to the campsite, my heart still racing. "There's someone out there, guys," I said. My voice was shaking. I saw a man in the woods. He was just standing there, and he didn't see me, but it was definitely there. We all looked at each other, a mixture of fear and confusion on our faces. "What's going on?" Courtney asked. We decided to turn in for the night, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the woods. All throughout the night, I could hear footsteps circling our campsite. I didn't move, because I was too afraid of whatever might be lurking out there. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, but it seemed so real. I really thought someone was there. What could I do? Eventually the sun rose, and I've never been so relieved. I poked my head out my tent and walked around the site. We could immediately tell that somebody had been there. Nothing was missing, but there were fresh cigarette butts all over the place, and none of us smoked. Even more terrifying was that there was a hole burned in the cover of one of my cousin's tents that was definitely not there before. We packed up camp in a hurry, our nerves frayed. As we hiked out of the woods, we felt like we were being watched. We reported the incident when we got back, but they were skeptical, telling us it was probably just some hikers passing through. But I knew what I had seen, and I was sure that we'd stumbled upon something sinister in the woods. I'm Amber, and this happened last summer. I went camping for my friend Jeremy's birthday. We'd been planning the trip for a long time, and we were all excited to spend the weekend in the woods. There were 5 of us total, 3 boys and 2 girls. We packed up our gear, loaded the car, and set off for the campground. The scenery was beautiful, the trees were tall and green, and the sky was a bright blue. The sun was shining down on us as we set up our tents. We started a fire and then cooked dinner. We laughed and told scary stories as the night went on, but little did we know, a real horror story was about to begin. The next day, we decided to go on a hike. We followed a trail, admiring the beauty of the forest and the sounds of the birds singing. We talked and laughed, enjoying each other's company, but when we returned to our campsite, we felt that someone had been there. My buck knife was missing, and one of my friends thought I must have lost it, but I was pretty sure I'd left it in my bag, which was in my tent. "Are you sure you just didn't lose it on the hike?" Jeremy asked, looking concerned. "I'm positive. It was in my bag the whole time. I checked before we left," I replied. We decided to stay for the night, but I was really scared and thought somebody was watching us. My friends tried to reassure me, but I really wanted to go. Everyone else wanted to stay though, so I was outnumbered. The next morning when we woke up, I forgot about the entire incident from before. We had another great day of hiking and hanging out, but when we came back to the campsite in the evening, Jeremy noticed that the tires on his car had been slashed. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, and there was no way to get back home. It would be at least a 5-hour walk to get to the main highway, where we would be sure to get a ride, but there was another road nearby that we could take. It was not as busy, but there was a chance that a car would come. We started walking down the gravel road, hoping to flag down a passing car, but there weren't any. We were alone, and the sun was starting to set. As we were walking, I looked back, and I noticed somebody else on the road. We couldn't see who it was, but we could feel their eyes on us. We quickened our pace, but the figure kept following. We were terrified, unsure what to do. "Come on, let's start running," Jeremy said, grabbing my arm. We started running, trying to get away from the figure that was chasing us. I looked back and saw that our stalker was holding my knife. We ran down that gravel road for a long time, and eventually, a car came from behind. We stood in the middle of the road waving our arms wildly. It stopped and gave us a ride. When we got in, the driver asked if we wanted to go back and get our other friend. We told him that it wasn't our friend and that he was chasing us. It felt like the end of Lord of the Flies. We didn't know who it was or why he was following, but we knew one thing for sure. We never wanted to go camping again. We never spoke of this again, but the memory of that man holding my knife, following us, stayed with me forever. This happened a few summers ago when I went camping with my best friends Ahmed, Daryl, and Chris. Daryl knew of a remote spot in the woods that his uncle had shown him. He and Chris were experienced with the outdoors, but Ahmed and I were fairly new to it. It was a few hours away from our town, and we drove there in Daryl's dad's truck. We made our way through the twisting roads and steep mountain passes. When we finally arrived, I was struck by the sheer beauty of the place. It was a 2 or 3 hour hike from where we parked the car. There was not another person to be found. We were really alone out there. The campsite was surrounded by dense forest, and there was a small creek running nearby. We set up camp and spent the afternoon exploring the area. It was public land and not an official campground, but it was a somewhat established site with a fire pit already there. As night fell, we built a campfire and settled in for the evening. We cooked up some dinner and cracked open a few beers. We only managed to carry in a single 6-pack, so that's all we had. The conversation flowed easily, and we were all having a great time. We called it a night around 1 a.m. and went to our tents. We had each brought our own tent, and we set them up next to each other on the only flat part of the site. I woke up in the middle of the night at around 3:30 a.m. I heard the sound of rustling in the bushes. At first I thought it was just an animal, but as I listened closer, I was pretty sure the steps sounded human. I lay there frozen, listening to the footsteps. I figured the only thing to do was to wait it out. I eventually fell back asleep and woke up at 6 a.m. In the morning, I didn't tell the guys what I heard. In fact, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or not. We did some more hiking in the area and had a pretty good day. But when we came back to the site, we noticed that some things were missing. Ahmed's lighter and knife were gone, both of which were left next to the fire pit. We looked at each other puzzled. Who could have taken them? We were the only ones there. As evening fell, I felt a sense of unease settling over me. I was paranoid that somebody was watching us. I never told my friends though. I just kept it to myself. I was really scared. We went to bed again at around 12 or 1. Like last night, I woke up at 3, but this time it was because I had to pee. I got up to go to the bathroom, and found myself staring up at the full moon. The moonlight was really bright, probably the brightest I had ever seen. I could see a fair distance into the woods. That's when I saw him, a man walking along in the distance. He was taking slow, deliberate steps and dragging his feet with each one. His clothes were tattered, and he wasn't even wearing shoes. I wanted to hide, but there were no large trees nearby. He turned and looked at me as he walked. His eyes were really creepy. The man smiled, and I felt a chill. It was a really remote spot, so this was weird. I couldn't understand who that guy was, or why he was out there. I went back to the tents and woke up the others, and then I told them what I'd seen. They were all a bit spooked, but we decided to stay put for the night. We huddled together around the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every twig snap and rustle in the bushes made us jump. We kept our voices low. We didn't want him to hear us talking about him. We continued to hear footsteps throughout the night, but I never saw the guy again. Maybe he didn't want to be seen. I don't know who or what was out there, but I was pretty sure that it wasn't friendly. In the morning, we all agreed to pack up and leave. We didn't want to risk running into that guy. We had another day planned, but we all knew that it was time to go. We hiked out for 3 hours, hardly saying a word to each other. It was tense. We finally made it to the car, and we felt relieved. That was when we knew we were safe. We never found out who he was, or if he was dangerous, but Ahmed never got his knife back, or his lighter, so we knew the man was armed. It may have been the most vulnerable feeling I've ever felt. We were sitting there in the night, not knowing where that man was. He could see us, but we couldn't see him. When Daryl told his uncle what happened, he was shocked too. He had used that site countless times before, and he knew how remote it was. There were hardly any other people out there. It was a real mystery. My friend and I had a camping trip planned. Neither of us had ever been before, so we booked an easy campsite with all the amenities you can think of. We packed up all the essentials and more. When we got to the place, we saw that our designated campsite already had a tent set up, but it looked old. It looked like it had been set up weeks ago, and it was pretty beat up. There was a fire pit, a backpack, and a bunch of other camping stuff. We went to the office to ask about it, but they said they didn't know what we were talking about. We led them back to the spot, and it was gone. Everything was gone. It was only a 10-minute walk back to the office. There's no way somebody could have packed up all that stuff and left absolutely no trace. The officer said we must have been in a different spot, but we were both sure that we had gone to the same spot. We tried to forget about it. We set up our tent, which took us longer than it probably should have, but like I said, we had both never been before. Once it started getting dark, we started prepping a fire and got some marshmallows. A camping cliché, I know, but you really can't beat roasting marshmallows. We just kind of sat around the fire and talked while eating a couple marshmallows, and then we started to prepare for bed once the fire died down. Once we were all cozy, we started hearing footsteps behind us. We explained it away as an animal, but the footsteps were heavy. I would think most animals would try to walk as quietly as possible. We just laid there in silence. I think we were both too scared to move. After a couple of moments of lying there, we started to hear the footsteps circling around us. They started to sound like they were walking away, so we decided to peek our heads out, and my heart sank. Right in front of us was the campsite that was set up earlier, but there's no way somebody could have set it up so quickly. Without thinking, we both decided to leave everything and run. It sounded stupid at the time, but we didn't even bring a phone or a flashlight. We just ran to the office, and the park ranger decided to come with us, but this time, when we got back, everything was gone. The creepy campsite and our campsite. The ranger was also in disbelief because he'd never seen anything like it either. To this day, we have no answers. We just know that we'll never go camping again. I went camping with my friends Ralph, Angus, and Raoul the summer after we graduated. We had been best friends through most of high school. Our other friend Todd couldn't make it because he started college the year before and he was still away. We had all been camping before, but not in this area. We were warned to be careful of bears, but we were not worried. We were all well versed with bear safety, and Ralph even brought his rifle just in case. We had been told that the campsite we had chosen was beautiful and peaceful, with a lovely lake and lots of hiking trails. One of our teachers had told us about it, and we were pretty excited. We drove to the site, and then we had to hike in about 3 hours because there was no car access. It wasn't a difficult hike. You could probably do it on a four-wheeler if you had decent skills. We didn't have one of those though, so it was walking for us. We carried our tents, sleeping bags, and supplies on our backs. The trail was beautiful. We joked and talked the whole way. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing. We saw some bear poop, but we didn't care. In fact, we actually wanted to see a bear. We reached our campsite with plenty of sunlight left, and we were amazed by how beautiful it was. We found a spot by the lake and set up our tents. There were lots of trees and plenty of shade. The water was crystal clear, and we could see fish jumping occasionally. We gathered some firewood and built a fire. I was feeling adventurous, and I decided to explore the area. Raoul came with me. We hiked for a few hours, enjoying the beautiful scenery. As we walked, we found more evidence of bears. There were scratches on trees and large piles of poop. We started to get a little nervous, but we reassured ourselves that we would be fine as long as we didn't do anything stupid. We returned to our campsite and sat around the fire roasting marshmallows and telling stories. By then, Ralph and Angus had hoisted what was left of our food into a tall tree to keep it away from the bears. That's really the minimum that you need to do. We stayed up late around the fire. It was a perfect night so far. We went to bed at around 3 a.m. I was sound asleep as soon as I laid down. However, I was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of screaming. I sat up confused and disoriented. It was still dim in my tent. It seemed like the sun was just rising. I looked at my phone and saw that it was 5:20 a.m. I heard loud growling noises. I poked my head out of my tent and saw a huge bear tearing apart Angus's tent. Angus was screaming and trying to get away. I was frozen in terror, and I didn't know what to do. I got out of my tent and stood there watching. I wanted to jump in and help my friend, but I knew I couldn't. Suddenly, Ralph jumped up and grabbed his rifle. He fired a warning shot in the air, and the bear disappeared. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and my ears were ringing. I turned to Ralph, who was still holding his rifle. He was pale and shaking. We realized then that we had to leave the campsite right away. We packed up our gear and took off down the trail. Ralph was clutching the rifle the whole way. We were too scared to stay in the area, even though we had planned to stay for another 3 nights. We hiked back to our car as quickly as we could, not wanting to look back or think about what could have happened if Ralph had not been there to scare the bear away. We made it back to our car and drove to the nearest ranger station. We reported the bear attack. He told us that we were lucky to have escaped, and that we should always be careful when camping in bear country. We drove to a nearby town and found a cheap motel where we could spend the night. We talked for hours about what happened and how lucky we were to be alive. Ralph came out looking like a hero, and to be honest, he deserves it. A terrifying thing happened to me and my sister Carly a few years ago. We both hadn't taken a vacation in a long time, and wanted to have a chance to catch up. We were in our early 30s. I'm 2 years older, and it was becoming more and more difficult for us to spend quality time together. Our plan was to spend 3 nights camping, with 3 or 4 hours of hiking in between sites. We were both excited to get away from our normal lives. On the first day of our trip, we parked the car at the entrance of one of the trails. As we began our hike, we were about an hour in, and we encountered a man named Tom. He was around 45 years old, tall and muscular with a gray beard. Tom seemed friendly at first, and we chatted for a few minutes before we moved on and went our separate ways. We had seen a few other people on the way, but none of them stuck out. The park was vast, and the further we went, the fewer people we saw. We hiked for a few hours and finally reached our first campsite at around 3 p.m. We set up our tent and some other things. We were tired from the hike and we decided to rest for a while. As the sun began to set, we started a small campfire and cooked some dinner. We sat around the fire talking and enjoying the peace and quiet of the wilderness. I was exhausted after the long day, so we went to bed early. I fell asleep almost immediately. I've always been comfortable sleeping in a tent, but in the middle of the night, I was suddenly awakened by a strange noise. I opened my eyes and saw a shadowy figure standing outside of our tent. It was Tom. As soon as he saw me, he disappeared into the forest. I was startled and frightened, but I didn't want to scare Carly, so I decided not to tell her. I was hoping that it was just a weird coincidence, and that Tom was passing by our campsite for some reason. But the next morning, as we were getting ready to start our hike for the next campsite, I saw Tom again. He was standing down the trail away from us, not moving, just standing there, watching. We decided to press forward anyway, and we reached the next campsite before sunset and quickly set up our tent again. As we were sitting around the fire, Tom appeared out of nowhere. He sat down next to us and said some really creepy things. We could tell that he was becoming increasingly agitated. We were scared and didn't know what to do. We tried to tell him to leave, but he wouldn't listen. He kept circling our campsite and staring at us. We spent the whole night sitting up, too frightened to sleep. We kept the fire burning all night, hoping it would keep Tom at bay. The next morning, we packed up our tent and hiked all the way out of there. It was a 2-day hike in, but we managed to do it in just under 3 hours on the way out. It was a little more downhill on the way back, but we also made good time because of the circumstances. We were happy when we finally reached the car before sunset. We reported Tom to the park rangers, but nothing came of it. They said they would keep an eye out for him, but they didn't seem too concerned. Part of me feels like they thought it was all in our heads, but it wasn't. That guy Tom was following us, and I have no doubt that he would have done something if we spent another night out there.
My name is Jason, and this happened when I was about 16 years old. I'm 27 now, and what happened that day changed my life forever. I live in West Virginia, where there are mountains all around, so I grew up in the woods hunting, camping, and riding ATVs. One day, me and my 2 best friends Brian and Jesse went out on our ATVs to find a place to camp out for the weekend. It was Thursday, and we wanted to find a place to camp on Saturday. We went pretty far into the woods to try and find the best spot we could, because we were planning to bring our girlfriends camping with us for the weekend. We made our way about 5 or 6 miles into the woods and found a small lake. It looked great, so we got off and checked everything out to make sure it wasn't private property or anything. There were no signs, and there wasn't a house, so we figured it was okay. "This is it," Jesse said, and we all agreed. It was perfect, so we all got back on our 4-wheelers and headed back, knowing that Saturday was going to be a night to remember. However, what we didn't know was that it would be the worst night of our lives. The next day, we loaded up our gear, fishing poles, tents, and sleeping bags. We made sure that we had everything we needed to make it a fun night, including 3 bottles of Mad Dog and a 30-pack of Bud Light in a cooler. We were ready. We all met up at around 11 o'clock on Saturday morning and headed out to our perfect camping spot. When we got there, it was great. We set everything up, put out the tents, and gathered firewood. The girls loved it too, except Brian's girlfriend. Her name was Kat. She said that she felt uneasy, but didn't know why. We figured it was just because she had never been camping before. We went fishing, swimming, and had a few drinks, just doing everything that teenagers do. But Kat kept looking around and wouldn't join us at all. She just sat there by the lake with a concerned look on her face. Eventually, it started to get dark, so we lit a fire and made some hot dogs. After that, we just sat around telling scary stories by the warmth of the smoldering logs. It was around 11:30 when Jesse's girlfriend Sam had to use the bathroom, and Kat went with her. They were gone for roughly 4 minutes. Then they came back running and said that Kat had seen somebody watching them in the forest. I grabbed my 9mm pistol, then me and Jesse went to check it out. We didn't find anything, so we thought that the scary campfire stories must have freaked them out. When we got back, we told them that we didn't see anything, but Kat said that she knew what she saw and that she wanted to leave. We convinced her to chill out and stop worrying. After another half hour, we were all ready to lay down and spend some alone time with our significant others. Nobody was even thinking about what Kat saw anymore. After an hour went by, my girlfriend Lindsay was asleep, but I was just laying there listening to the sound of the woods. Suddenly, I started to hear footsteps. At first I thought it was just one of the others, but I could tell whoever was walking was trying to do it quietly. Maybe one of them had gotten up to use the bathroom and wanted to be quiet. That's what I told myself at the time anyway. The footsteps stopped at my tent door. I sat there terrified, but didn't make a sound. Whatever it was, it stood there for at least 3 minutes. Then I saw the zipper start to slowly move. I reached for my gun, but to my embarrassment, I left it in my bag, which was out by the fire. The zipper continued to move slowly. Suddenly, Lindsay coughed, then it stopped. She was still asleep and blissfully unaware that the unknown creep was trying to enter our tent. I heard nothing for about 5 minutes. Then the sound of footsteps started again, but this time, they were moving away from my tent. All I could do was stay quiet and hope that it didn't come back. 30 minutes had passed when all of a sudden, the most crazy, evil-sounding scream I'd ever heard came from Brian and Kat's tent. After that, they started screaming too. I jumped up and burst out of my tent and made a run for the bag with the gun. I grabbed the bag and shoved my hand in, then pulled out my handgun. Then I looked over at Brian and Kat's tent. What I saw still haunts my dreams to this day. There was a pale, long-armed man standing next to Brian and Kat's tent. I couldn't tell much else about his appearance because it was dark, but I could see the moonlight reflecting off a large blade in his right hand. He had a knife, and he was ready to use it. I fired my gun in his direction, not actually trying to hit him, especially because Brian and Kat were there too. He then turned his attention to me, and when I noticed that, I started shaking uncontrollably. I fired again, my hands barely stable enough to take the shot. Miraculously, I managed to scare the guy away, and he took off running into the woods, screaming. Then I did a quick scan of the campsite. The girls were crying. Jesse puked all over the place, and I felt like I was in a nightmare. I was scanning the woods, gun in hand, hoping that whoever it was didn't come back. Jesse and the girls were all huddled up to me as we made our way back to the ATVs. I was looking into the woods the whole time, hoping that the guy didn't come back. We got to the ATVs, and then I realized that I'd left the keys in the tent. I sprinted back to the campsite and quickly grabbed the keys. Just then, the guy emerged from the bush and ran straight at me. I fired 2 or 3 shots while I was still standing still. I'm not sure if either of them connected, but he screamed, then turned around and ran back into the woods again. I ran back to the ATVs, then we rode out of there so fast that I'm surprised we didn't crash. We went right to the cops and told them everything that happened. They went up to where we were, then came back after what seemed like forever. Then they took us back with them. By then, it was daytime, and everything was destroyed. The tents were ripped up, and stuff was thrown everywhere. The cops said it looked like a black bear did it, and that we were drunk, and we must have mistaken what we saw. I know that what we saw was not a black bear. It's been 10 years since this happened, and I never found a reasonable explanation for who that guy was. It was written up as a bear attack, but I know that's not what happened. I've never talked about it with anyone until now. Jesse and Sam got married and moved to Florida. Lindsay moved too, but we broke up not long after the incident. What still gets me, however, is that he was at our tent first until Lindsay coughed. He stopped and moved on after that, so it's very possible that a cough saved my life. I'm a 20-year-old woman, and I live in Michigan. I was 16 years old when these events took place, and I'm a huge athletic nerd, so I like to go hiking almost every day. I picked the wrong day to go one time, and I experienced something that I don't wish to experience again. I drove to the hiking trail, and when I got there, I saw a creepy-looking guy, and it looked like he was probably in his mid-30s. Me being the stubborn, hard-headed kid that I was back then, I ignored my gut and started jogging on the trail anyway. I took a short glance at him, then continued on the trail. Eventually, I was 200 or 300 yards away from the entrance, and I took a short break. Soon after, I heard a scream from what sounded like a man. I looked down the path and saw something that made my heart drop. I saw the guy running straight towards me. I felt a giant adrenaline rush because of that, and I started to run as fast as I could. The guy was running so fast, and he was catching up to me. I was a really good runner, but even still, he was gaining ground. This guy ran like he had just taken 2 shots of steroids, and I started to cry and panic. I took a sharp turn into the woods, trying to lose him. Then I tried to run back to the parking area. I kept hearing his footsteps not too far behind me as I kept running. The footsteps started to slow down when I got closer and closer to the parking lot. At last, I made it to my car and cried tears of joy as I took out my cell phone and called the cops. Not long after they arrived, they searched the trail and found the man. He was a homeless guy, 37 years old, they said. The scariest part was that they found a large butcher's knife in one of his coat pockets. I barely made it out with my life that day. That guy had some seriously bad intentions, and I hope I never run into him again. It started on a hot summer with some friends on a camping trip in the woods of Florida. We were still on the road to the site when we came across an entrance that was blocked off by a sign that said "Stay away, no trespassing." I pointed it out to my friends, knowing that they would want to check it out. Looking back, I know that was a mistake, and I should have kept my mouth shut. We arrived at our site, and as soon as we got out of the truck, they insisted that we investigate that enclosed area, and they wanted me to tag along. I didn't want to, but they convinced me to go, since they said it would be fun and exciting, so I agreed. We walked on the dirt road from our site to the closed-off road, and then hiked in. Something I noticed once we entered the area were the trees. They seemed dry and white, like something had sucked the life out of them. We kept walking, and saw an abandoned campsite. We thought there may be some stuff there that we could take back to our camp, but there was nothing good. Suddenly, we heard a deep voice that said, "Get out now." We looked around scared, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness. We had a flashlight with us, and we flashed it around for a bit, but we couldn't find the source of the voice. Next, we tried to backtrack to our campsite for a while. Then we realized we were walking in circles. Just then, another voice said, "We warned you." I was frustrated at that point, so I said back, "We're lost. We're trying to leave." We kept on walking for what seemed like hours, but we got nowhere. There were 5 of us in the group, and eventually, I noticed that one of my friends was missing. We looked all over the place, but we saw no sign of him. We shouted his name into the dark woods, but there was no answer. We couldn't explain how he disappeared from the group, but he did. Then one of my friends, Mike, spoke out and said, "I heard that some people sometimes go missing from this area and are never seen again." Then I said to him, "Don't you think you should have told us that before we came here?" "I'm sorry, I just thought it was some fake story to keep people out," he said. When I was done arguing with him, I noticed that someone else was missing from the group. Then we were down to 3 out of 5 people, and I was thinking to myself that this reminds me of that movie Predator. We were being hunted. Then I heard another voice say,
"You can't escape from us."
Chills ran down my spine when I heard that, but I kept walking on the dirt road that we thought was the path. What else was there to do? Eventually, though, there was a dead end, and those dead trees were blocking the way. Those ugly, white, dried-up trees. We were trapped. I looked carefully at a tree, then I saw something move, and when I looked closely, it opened its eyes. There was something stalking us in the woods. I jumped and screamed when I saw that, then I asked the guys if they noticed it too, and they did. It was too dark to tell what the creature was, but it seemed to live in the trees. There was also no way to tell how many of them there were. All I knew was that we were being hunted, and there was nothing we could do about it. With no other options, the 3 of us decided to run. We ran with an intensity that I didn't know I had, and eventually, we passed the no trespassing sign that we saw on the way in. Not long after that, we made it to the truck. The 3 of us drove out that night and reported the incident to the police. Unfortunately, no trace of our lost friends were ever found. We mourned them for a while and eventually moved on. Please, if you ever come across an area that's marked "Do Not Enter," then don't enter. We made that mistake and paid a horrible price. I used to live on a small farm in the US. As soon as I turned 18, I moved away, and I'll tell you why. When I was 12, me and my best friend Zach, who lived down the road, we used to go into the woods near the neighborhood to play. Since we lived in the country, there was almost nothing else to do. We would always explore and pretend to be treasure hunters. I always used to take my dad's old cowboy hat, and Zach would take a small shovel with him. If the weather was bad, we would just stay home and play Nintendo 64, but we preferred to get outside most days. We would always go a bit deeper into the forest every time we went in, just to keep it exciting. We usually managed to find something interesting in the woods. Old coins, water bottles, some nice looking stones, and other things. I know it sounds like really lame stuff, but we were kids, and at the time, it was a lot of fun. I had a small box under my bed, where I put some of the things that I found, and Zach had one too. We had an awesome childhood, but some really creepy things started to happen over time. One day while we were exploring the forest, we came across an old well and got really excited. We thought we actually found something good for once. We checked it out, but there was nothing special, and the well was dry. So we pretty much got our hopes up for nothing. We headed back home, and the day was over. The next day was Friday, and when we got back home from school, Zach went back to his house, and I went back to mine. Not long after having lunch, Zach rang my doorbell. I grabbed my dad's hat and opened the door. When I opened it, Zach was there with 2 other boys. They were much bigger than me and Zach. He introduced them as his cousins, saying they were staying with his mom and dad for the weekend. Their names were Danny and Simon, and they were both 15, 3 years older than Zach and I. They wanted to come with us into the woods. I agreed, so we headed there. It was just a normal day for the most part, but Zach's cousins were total jerks. They kept saying that it sucked to be out in the woods, and asked us how we never got bored out there. Later that night at around 11 o'clock, I heard a knock on my bedroom window. It was Zach with his cousins, and they told me to come down. I managed to get downstairs without awakening my parents, then I opened the door. Zach and his cousins asked me if I wanted to go to the woods. I'd never been out there at night before, and to be honest, I didn't want to go. I said no at first, but they fired back and called me a loser. Then they turned around and left. They went off in the direction of the woods, and just before they disappeared into the darkness, I changed my mind, so I grabbed my dad's hat and ran after them. I managed to catch up with the group before they entered the forest, and when we got there, we started to walk deeper into the woods. I was really scared, and by the look on Zach's face, he was scared as well. The cousins stayed in front, shining their flashlights on the spooky trees. I noticed that we were walking in the direction of the well that Zach and I had found before. I knew the place like the back of my hand, so I had a plan in case something happened. We were getting close to the well, and suddenly the cousins stopped, then abruptly turned off their flashlights. I asked one of them what was wrong, but they just stood there like statues. Then I leaned in and peeked over their shoulders, since I had stayed behind them. When I saw what they were looking at, I froze as well. There was a person standing in front of the well, thankfully not looking in our direction. I stood there like a statue as well, not knowing what to do. Then one of the cousins, I think it was Simon, whispered, "Turn around slowly and walk away slowly. Don't make any sudden moves." I did what he said. We all turned around and started walking back slowly so the figure wouldn't notice us. Then something terrible happened. I stepped on a stick by accident, and it made a noticeable snap. It was loud, and we weren't far enough away from that figure, so we all stopped again. I looked back, and now the figure was looking at us. I almost fainted from fear. Then Danny screamed, "Run," and we all floored it. I dropped my hat while I was running, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I didn't know if the figure was following us, since all our footsteps made it hard to hear. I didn't look back either, so I really didn't know. We eventually made it back to safety. I ran into my house and slammed the door. My parents were awake, and I got yelled at by them. I was grounded for a week, but they also looked really relieved. My mom hugged me and said, "I'm so glad you're safe." I was confused, and I asked them what they were so worried about. Then they told me something really terrifying. They told me that recently, an escaped killer was on the loose, and he was spotted in our area. When my dad noticed that I was not in my room, they thought I had been kidnapped, and they were about to call the police. Fortunately, I came through the door before they did. After hearing that, I started crying. My parents asked me why, and I told them what had happened. I told them about the woods and the man we saw by the well. Their faces turned pale when I told them that. They called the police immediately. Later on, when they arrived, I explained everything to them as well. They said they would take a look into the woods. Half an hour later, they came back with nothing, but they said that the next day they would bring more cops to search the area. They also warned me not to go into the woods again, and I was happy to agree with that. I could barely sleep that night because I was so afraid that the man would come for me. The next day, more cops came to our farm and started investigating the woods. They also went to Zach's house. My mom came in and said she found Dad's hat on the doorstep. I remember that last night I had dropped it, so I was not sure how it got there. I thought about it some more, and the man in the woods came to mind, so I started panicking again. My parents calmed me down and asked me what was wrong. I told them about the hat. They had a nervous look on their faces, and my dad took the hat to the cops outside. I managed to calm down again, and for the rest of the day, I just played video games, since I was grounded for sneaking out. Around lunchtime, we got a knock at the door, and I answered it. Zach and his mom stood on our doorstep. Zach's mom asked if she could talk to my parents, so I went to get them. Then they told us to go to my room. I put my ear against the door and listened. Zach's mom told my parents that Danny wasn't at the house in the morning, and after hearing the news about the creep in the woods, she began to worry. One thing didn't make sense though. All four of us made it out safely, so I was confused. Then Zach told me something that scared the living crap out of me. He said that Danny had left the house when they got back. He left while Simon and Zach were sleeping. What Danny didn't know was that Zach wasn't really asleep. Zach said he looked out the window and saw him walk into the woods. He wanted to stop him, but he was too scared to go out there again. Danny never came back. I asked him why he left, but Zach didn't know. Later on, Simon came over to hang out as well,
I asked him if he knew why Danny left the house. He said that he had an idea. Danny always used to carry his dead mother's ring with him. His mother had died a year prior to the events of this story. He always used to keep it in a box, and he would take it with him wherever he would go. Simon checked the box in the morning, and it was empty. He must have dropped it while he was running from the guy that night. After that day, as weeks went by, the guy in the woods was never caught. The cops started an investigation into Danny's disappearance, but he was also never found. Me and Zach never went back into the woods again, and once we turned 18, we bought a house together and became roommates. Nothing's better than having your best friend as a roommate. Now I'm 25, and I live with my girlfriend as well. Zach and I are still close, and I think about that night almost every day. I probably will for the rest of my life. I was 13 at the time of this occurrence, and I had been reading creepypastas and true stories back then. I live in Carroll Island, a place where you can find a lot of forests everywhere. This was located in Baltimore County, and I loved hearing scary stories about this place. I always loved the forests around there, and I lived in a house since I was 6 or 7 years old with my family. The forests, like in any other town, always had some urban legends behind them. Most of these were told by older kids who were just trying to scare the younger ones. The teens would always go into the woods to smoke or drink alcohol. I hated that, but it's how they got their kicks. I was outside my house sometime in January on a full moon. This is when some of those killer clown incidents were starting to die off and then come back in April of 2017. I never believed in them, and I still don't, but that night, I started to question myself. I walked inside my house with my brother and my friend who we'll call Kyle. Kyle was from the Dominican Republic and had always believed in the paranormal, so we had a good bit in common. We walked into my brother's room, since it was the largest, and we were watching Logan Paul's controversial video, you know the one. Once it was done, Kyle remembered that it was a full moon, and the clowns were out because of it. I called BS and told him it was all a hoax, and just insane people dressed up in costumes. He doubled down and said that if I didn't believe it, they'd get me. I laughed at his remark and told him to stop believing in that stuff. That's when my brother Josh sat up and said that I was just a wuss. I told him he was a jerk and that it was funny. We got into a conversation for a good 10 minutes, then Kyle finally said, "Then why don't you prove it?" I said okay and told him I'd be back. "I know just the place to prove it," I added. There was a little place down the road that was put there for a park. It wasn't funded, and the only thing it had was a small walk bridge that was pretty nice. We called it the Duck Pond, but it was actually Seneca Creek in Baltimore. I left the house and got onto my bike to ride the few blocks to the park. At the entrance there was another set of woods that was private property for the houses on the water, and there were also some abandoned houses among them. The entrance was easy to see, you couldn't miss it, and it was actually a pretty nice place during the day. As I was walking up to the entrance, I noticed a foul odor. Keep in mind that this is nature, where things die and decompose right there. I was about to walk into the park when I heard something. It was a voice, spoken in a low, somewhat luring tone.
"Hey there, kiddo. Why don't you come over here?"
That was when I went into full panic mode. I'm someone who isn't scared off so easily, but I thought that it could be someone out there. It was unknown, and that scared me. I turned towards the small patch of bushes near the entrance, and I saw something crouched over, deep in the bushes, facing me. I couldn't tell if it was a clown or a demon. I didn't even care at that point. Even thinking about it made me paranoid. Even still, I was about to go in and see what it was. Then it spoke again.
"That's right. Come over here."
Then, I heard the sheathing of a blade. That's when I knew it was time to book it. I instantly wailed out in fright and turned around to run away. Then I crashed into my bike. If I hadn't been riding for so many years and built up the muscle power to get out of there, I would have been done. I floored it back to my house, At that point, my body was in complete hysteria, and Kyle said that once I opened the door, I was not comprehensible. It took me a minute to calm down, and I realized I shouldn't be so scared. I explained to Kyle and Josh what had just happened, and we agreed to go back there the next day and mess up whoever was there. We never did that though, and I never go there at night. Creepy man in the bushes, whoever you are, if you're still out there, let's not meet. At the time of this story, I was a 12-year-old male who lived in California. For a summer trip, my family and I flew to Boise, Idaho for a week to stay with my cousins. We stayed at their house for 2 days. On the third day, we drove to a small city in the Rocky Mountains of central Idaho. They owned a cabin in Ketchum. The first day, we went fishing at nearby lakes, played some games, and met a few of the neighbors on the small street. Everybody was nice. It was amazing. I thought nothing could go wrong. The room where I slept was at the back of the house. There was no fence at the backyard because it backed onto a freezing cold river. Directly on the other side of the river was a huge mountain covered by a thick forest of pine trees. A small path started on the other side of the river, but there was no bridge. The house was about 1/4 of a mile down the nearest road. I went to bed that night and woke up at 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. So I got up and did my thing, then I headed back to my room. When I got into bed, I felt really hot, so I opened the window. Not more than 15 minutes after I opened it, I heard the most terrifying screech from the forest. It was raspy and very high-pitched. I know for a fact it wasn't human. I've heard some scary stories on YouTube channels that often describe creatures that make weird noises that sound sort of human, but aren't. I heard it once more, but this time closer. In the morning when we woke up, we explored the town. At 7 p.m., my sister and my cousins got permission from our parents to explore the forest. I was uneasy, considering what I had heard the night before, and now it was nearing night. My oldest cousin Alex, who was 16, took a loaded pistol, a lighter, and a backpack of snacks. I carried a hunting knife and a flashlight. My cousin Julia just took a flashlight. My sister Brianna and my other cousin Karina took some extra batteries and a small bag of candy. We made our way across the bridge at the end of the street and back to the path that was on the other side of the river from our house. All of us began the hike to the top of the mountain. We made it to the top of Bald Mountain in an hour and a half. The view from 9,000 feet was incredible. At 8:55, Alex and I figured it was time to head down and ordered the group to the path. At that point, the sun had fully set and it was dark. Julia and I turned on our flashlights and shined them ahead as we walked. Halfway down the mountain, which was about 45 minutes into the walk, I got a dreadful feeling. The kind you get when you're being watched or followed. Something ran out from the bushes and scurried in the tree line to the right. I brushed it off as some type of small animal though. 5 minutes later, we heard something that made me tingle with fear, and my heart dropped into my stomach. That same horrifying screech from last night echoed through the forest from about 2 miles away. Then I told everyone that we needed to move faster, and we did. It went off again, but closer. Whatever that thing was, it was moving faster than us. We were full on speed walking by then, and that still wasn't enough. Soon the screeching stopped, and we heard loud footsteps 30 yards to the right. I got the feeling that we were being watched again. Alex took his gun out and fired 2 shots in the general direction of the steps. The creature backed off, but even though we thought it was gone, I still had the sense that we were being watched. As the river came into sight, it caught me and everyone else by surprise. I heard the gravel path crunching behind us. I looked back into the darkness, and I saw the outline of something that resembled a human. It was on the path behind us, about 200 yards back. I told Alex, and his face went pale when he looked. We told the rest of the group quietly, and on 3, we all broke out into a full-on sprint towards the river. Whatever that thing was, it was extremely fast. When we reached the river, There wasn't time to get to the bridge, which was a quarter mile farther down. That thing was catching up fast. We jumped in and swam through the ice-cold water. The creature got to the river just as we made it to the bank on the other side. Julia and I shined our flashlights and finally got a good look. It was massive, a hairy creature that was about 7 feet tall. It had huge razor-sharp claws like a bear. Its eyes glowed red when the flashlights shined on them. Alex fired a shot, and then it darted off with one final screech. We all looked at each other with pure terror, shock and surprise. Alex explained everything to our parents. They didn't know what to make of it, and we never heard anything like it again. I am thankful that nothing happened to us, and that I noticed the creature behind us when I did. If I hadn't, one of the others in the group might have noticed it, and it would have been too late. The next time I stay at that cabin, I'm not going into the woods at night. I'm Carson, and I was 17 when this happened. My best friend at the time was Ethan, and this story is about something that happened to both of us. We lived in a town in Washington State. It was generally a boring place to live, but the wilderness around the area made up for it. Most of my friends and neighbors would spend their free time camping, fishing, hunting, and doing other outdoor things. On a warm summer day, Ethan and I decided to venture into the woods with no real plan. I brought my fishing pole because there was a good spot not far from where we were headed. Ethan brought his portable speaker so that we could have music. The woods were dense, and the tall trees towered overhead, casting cool shadows over the forest floor. We walked for about an hour, taking in the sights and sounds of the wilderness around us. We spotted many different species of birds and other animals, and we heard the soft rustling of leaves in the wind blowing through the branches. We talked while we walked, just discussing girls or whatever, when we came across a clearing that looked like it had been disturbed. There were broken branches and torn leaves scattered all around, and the ground was all churned up, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Ethan and I approached the clearing cautiously. Our senses were on high alert. We could see that there was a large pile of leaves and sticks in the center of the clearing. They had clearly been put there by a person, but we didn't know why. I got the creeps and suggested that we should head back. Ethan agreed, and we turned around. Not long after that, maybe 20 or 30 steps, I found something on the ground. It was a wallet, and it was laying right on top of the forest floor. It must have been dropped recently, because there was no rain damage or anything. I picked it up and opened it. There wasn't any cash, not that I would have stolen it if there was, just saying. There was, however, a driver's license, and several other pieces of ID. Even though we lived in a relatively small town, I didn't recognize the guy in the pictures. I put it in my pocket, and we kept walking. Something didn't sit right about the whole thing, though. We were really creeped out, and neither of us knew exactly why. It was just a wallet, after all. We made our way back to the edge of the forest, and walked back into town. We went straight to the police station, and told the officers what we found. They listened to our story, and surprisingly, they were very concerned. They sent a team of investigators to the spot to collect evidence. The police combed through the area, and they found several disturbing things. Not far from where we found the wallet, they found a black garbage bag that was filled with clothes. Nothing particularly sinister, they weren't covered with blood or anything, but it was really creepy. We later found out that the man with the wallet was reported missing, and the clothes in the bag were determined to be his. Ethan and I were called to give our testimony, and we told the police everything we could remember about our discovery. It's been 2 years since this happened, and the man was never found. I didn't mention this before, but my town actually has a really high crime rate, and there's a dark underbelly involving the drug trade. If I had to guess, I would say that this had something to do with that. Either way, we learned that day that the woods can be very dangerous and scary. Endless rows of trees and thick brush are a favorite for criminals looking to hide evidence. We found something that day, and I hope it doesn't happen again. This happened a few weeks ago. I live in a nice neighborhood near my friends. I'll refer to myself as Dan, and my friends as Lucas, Kyle, and Dean. There's a big stretch of woods at the end of our cul-de-sac in my friend's neighborhood. We use it to get to Publix, which is a grocery store. It was around 2 o'clock when we decided to head out to Publix, but on the way there, my friend Kyle said that we should explore an abandoned warehouse and trailers. We all agreed because it sounded like fun. What's the worst that could happen? I don't want to forget to mention that these woods are known to have homeless people living there. There would be tents and other stuff scattered throughout. As we approached the warehouse, we saw a bunch of junk tents left by homeless people. My friend Kyle started messing with it, throwing bikes and kicking stuff. You know, just being normal teens. We looked around at the stuff and started burning paper and other things with the lighters that we picked up. Eventually, after a while, we headed out to Publix and picked up some food. After spending the whole day with Kyle and Dean, me and my friend Lucas headed over to his place to chill because Kyle and Dean had to head out. By around 9:30, I had the idea to go and explore the woods again. I asked Lucas if he was down. He said, yeah, sure. We were both scared because the woods are crazy scary in the dark. Our phones were only at about 15%, so we had to use them sparingly. Eventually, we made it to the woods. Lucas brought a flashlight so we wouldn't have to use our phones. We started blasting some yeet, because why not? We were crazy, and we were scared, so we needed something to take our minds off of it. I told my friend to turn it off once we got pretty far into the woods. I didn't want any homeless people to know we were there. We were about halfway to the Publix when I saw a glowing orange thing to my right. I looked closer. It was a campfire. I looked up and there were 3 massive homeless people sitting right there. I looked at my friend and said run, and we started running. While we did, Lucas said that he heard footsteps. Adrenaline kicked in, and I started running faster than ever. Lucas looked back, and there he was. The guy from around the campfire was chasing us at full speed. We sprinted and made it out of the woods. We told our other friends, and they suggested we go back. Next week, we went back and found nothing. A few days ago, we were in the same woods at night with my friends. I was getting sticks and stuff to burn when I heard a faint whisper saying, "Come here." I jumped a bit, but laughed it off thinking that it was just one of my friends. I headed back to where they were and said, "Nice joke, guys." They all looked at me with a confused expression. They all said it wasn't them. Needless to say, these events have been hands down the scariest moments of my life. This story is about me and my closest friend, whose name is David. We both live in a small town surrounded by lush green forests, and we've always had a passion for exploring the wilderness. One day, we decided to venture into the woods and see what we could find. We packed our bags with food, water, and some basic supplies, and then set out on our adventure. The woods were alive with sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling. We hiked for a few hours, taking in the beauty of the forest. As we made our way deeper, we stumbled upon a strange cabin in a secluded area. It looked abandoned and run down, and it seemed like it had been there for years. We approached it cautiously, our senses on high alert. As we got closer, we noticed that the door was slightly ajar. David and I nervously exchanged a glance, and then pushed the door open. We stepped inside, and were immediately struck by the mess that we saw. The cabin was cluttered with old newspapers, broken furniture, and cans of food. We walked around the living room for a minute or two. Neither of us said a word. Then we went to the kitchen, which was also in disarray. However, one thing was out of place. Sitting on top of the dusty table was a black bag that was clean and looked brand new. As soon as we saw it, we knew that it didn't belong. I looked at David, and after an uncomfortable silence, he said, "Should we open it?" I didn't want to, but I didn't want my friend to think I was scared, so I walked over to the bag, pulled down the zipper, and opened the top. Sitting in the bag was a pile of money so large that I genuinely have no idea how much it was. I can't even ballpark it.
I stepped away in disbelief. Then David walked over and looked inside. We looked at each other. You may think we'd be excited, but we'd watched enough crime stuff on TV to know better. A pile of money like this is clear evidence of some kind of illegal activity. David and I knew that we stumbled upon something big, and we quickly left the cabin and headed back into the woods. Once we were out, a feeling of relief fell upon me. It really was kind of a rush to find something like that and get away with it. As we were walking through, David and I heard a noise in the distance, and it was getting louder. It sounded like a car, but there were no roads for miles. Through the trees, we could see an ATV making its way through the forest towards the cabin. We hid behind a tree and watched for as long as we could. We couldn't see much, but it really looked like they were headed for the cabin. I'm pretty sure that would have been bad news for us if we'd stayed much longer. When we got home, David and I told our parents what we found, and then my dad called the police. The authorities were shocked by the information that we provided, and they immediately launched an investigation. The investigation led to the arrest of several people who were involved in the drug trade. It was one of the biggest busts in our area for years. This experience was unforgettable for both of us, but the scariest thing is to think of what would have happened if those guys got to the cabin while we were still there. It was a sunny afternoon when my best friend Alex and I decided to go for a walk in the woods near our neighborhood. We were only 14 years old back then, and it was summer vacation. We had been there many times before. Little did we know that this particular trip would be memorable for all the wrong reasons. We met at my house at around noon, and then headed out with nothing but the clothes on our backs. We weren't planning to go for long, so we didn't bother to bring any food or any water. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the scent of pine filled the air. We walked for about half an hour. We were still in well-charted territory that we had seen many times. We stopped to take a break and sat on a fallen tree that was partially hollowed out at the end. Alex and I talked for a bit, and then we got up to keep walking. But as we were about to turn away, I saw something. There was something stuffed into the hollow end of the tree. I walked over and reached in. What I found is the source of nightmares to this day. Inside that tree, I found a handgun. My 14-year-old mind hardly knew what to think. Alex thought it was cool, but I was terrified. It was a black handgun, but I didn't know enough about guns back then to say anything else. I'm almost sure it was real though. I put it back exactly how I found it, and then I told Alex that we had to get out of there. We walked quickly until we got out of the woods, which only took about 15 or 20 minutes. When we got back to the street, we discussed what to do. I wanted to tell my parents, but Alex wanted to keep it a secret. In the end, I decided to tell, and I didn't care what he thought. As soon as I got home, I told my mom what happened. The trail was right near my house, so I was pretty scared. My mom called the police immediately and told them what I found. Later that day, I went back with 2 officers to find the gun. However, when we got to the spot, it was gone. The police told me to stay back, and then they searched the area for several minutes before they gave up. The gun was gone. Someone had taken it. It had only been a few hours since I found it in the first place, so that meant whoever stashed it there could not be far. The police filed a report, but we never heard anything back afterwards. You may be thinking that Alex took the gun, but I don't think that could be true. He swore that he didn't, and I believed him. The dark reality is that someone in my neighborhood had a reason to hide that handgun, and they were in the woods that day. I never found out why it was there, or if it was linked to some kind of crime. What really creeps me out now, though, is that my fingerprints were on that thing. Who knows if or when they will come up. It's been over 6 years now, so it seems unlikely. It's still scary, though. I'll start off by saying that this isn't my story, but it was such a crazy encounter that I have since asked each of my friends through the years to recount the events. This happened around the year 2000. About a year after this took place, I started dating one of these friends, and that's when I first heard the story. I've since asked each of them, over years and miles apart, and they all remember the same encounter. Before my ex was even my boyfriend, let's call him Jay, he and our other friends were about 17 or 18 years old. At that age, I remember it being an adventure to find a place to smoke. The four of them decided to drive to Mount Pisgah, a beautiful wooded area outside of Eugene, Oregon. It's more of a hill, but it's nature in its prime for sure. I've been out there many times growing up, and I know exactly which trail they were on. It was Jay and his best friend B, and their girlfriends S and M. They had driven in B's little white sedan, parked in the parking lot, and hiked the trail to the river, where they smoked some bowls. The group spent the day out there, swimming and puffing and swimming, just being typical teens. I can imagine that hunger is what drove them to go home after a few hours, as the sun began to set. Either activity alone is bound to get someone hungry, let alone both. They walked along the well-worn main dirt path to the parking lot. This has been paved since then, as I saw on Google Maps. It didn't take but 20 minutes or so for them to get back to the little footbridge by the parking lot, which they had crossed when they hiked in. When they reached the small footbridge near the parking lot, B looked out into the vast field between them and the wooded mountain. He noticed a huge dog. They all later described it as the biggest dog they had ever seen. It was just sitting there, not looking scary, just looking like a humongous friendly dog, about 70 yards away. It was starting to get dark, but from M's description and the drawing she did for me years later, in 2005, it was very shaggy and furry. My friends continued to walk across this small wooden bridge. Then one of the girls screamed that the big dog was now on its hind legs, standing much closer than when they had seen him just a couple seconds earlier. It had traversed most of the large field in the seconds it took them to cross this 10-foot bridge. Whatever that thing was, it was fast, quiet, and stealthy. My four friends ran to the car, and they had the classic cliche, I can't get the key in moment, because B was fumbling madly with the keys. At this point, the dog was standing at the very edge of the parking lot, looking at them. As my ex Jay had said, every time they looked up, he was closer, but not moving. All of them recounted how surreal it was to see a dog standing on its hind legs. I don't know if it ran for a few ticks and then stood up again at intervals in the field, but that's the way they describe it. Many times I asked them if they were sure it wasn't a bear. They would always say no, it was definitely a dog standing on its hind legs, a big dog that was stalking them. Also, this is in the Lane County, Oregon, in the year 2000. There are few if any bears out there. It would be odd, but then again, I wasn't there. The kids got into the car and sped off, leaving the Pisgah dog to its own business. I've never had a reason to doubt any of their stories. In fact, S doesn't like talking about the incident at all, because it's too creepy for her. I'm an 18-year-old male, but I was 17 at the time of this incident. I've had some weird things happen to me throughout my life, but nothing like this. My parents were having a get-together at our house, but it seemed like it was dying down. I was getting bored, and then I got a call from one of my close friends, Luke, who wanted me to come over. I replied back saying sure, I'm bored anyway. He said that my other friends Colton, Ryan, and Matthew were also over there, and they were waiting for me. I said I'd be there in 10 minutes or so. When I got there, I walked in and couldn't find anybody at first. I looked all over the house and eventually found everyone except Luke. I asked over and over again where he was, but they gave me the same sarcastic answer. I assumed they were messing with me, so I played along and went to look. Let me give you a layout of the house. He has a relatively long driveway that has a few curves with a barn on one side of the driveway, opposite the house. The house is mainly surrounded by woods and fields. I searched around the house for a while, and they ended up telling me that he was in the barn, so I went out there to check. When I walked in, I couldn't hear anything, so I called him on his cell phone. He didn't pick up, so I just gave up. Just as I did, I got a phone call. It was from Luke. I picked up and said, "Dude, where are you?" He replied, "I'm in the woods at the back. You have to come find me." I hung up, dreading having to walk through that dark field by the woods. Why would he go back there anyway? It was dark and cold, and practically a swamp back there. Then I got another phone call. It was Luke again. I asked why he would go back there, because it's so wet and cold. He told me to come to the tree line. Something sounded really off with his voice, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I told him I was coming, and walked through the swampy field. That's when I got another phone call. It was Ryan. He asked me where I went, and said that they were looking all over for me. I told him I was going to get Luke. What he said next made my heart drop into my stomach. He said that Luke was standing right next to him. I asked why he called me, and said that he was in the woods. Ryan told me he was in the garage, and that his phone was dead. It had been dead all day. I felt like my heart punched the inside of my stomach when he told me this. I sprinted back to the house, not caring how wet it was. When I got back, Luke charged his phone and showed me that there were no recent outgoing calls. I'm a 22-year-old male, currently in my last semester of college, and this story takes place during my freshman year at the same college. I go to a smaller university in Connecticut. It's located pretty much right at the base of a popular state park with a large mountain. If you're familiar with Connecticut, then I'm sure you can guess which university I'm talking about. There's a lot of Native American folklore associated with the mountain. Native American tribes used to live in the surrounding area, and some weird things have definitely happened there. A kid even fell to his death while hiking not too long ago, but I highly doubt that was due to anything paranormal. Behind my freshman dorm building, there was a steep hill that led into the woods. This is where everyone in our building would go to smoke weed. Halfway up the hill, there was a little cleared out space with a concrete wall that you could sit on, and then a much larger area at the top of the hill with trails and a bigger concrete wall. It was a nightly occasion for me and my roommates to head up to those woods and smoke a little. Usually there were other people smoking too, so we were completely fine going up there at any time. One night, my roommate and I headed to the hill, just like we did every night. Our other roommate stayed behind because he had to study or do homework. We climbed the hill and went to the smaller clearing halfway up rather than the larger area. There was no one else up there, and it was a little later than when we normally went. It was right around midnight, but like I said, we felt safe enough to go up there at any time. We smoked a couple bowls and just hung out for a while. Keep in mind that both of us smoked pretty regularly, so 2 bowls wasn't going to do much for us, and I'm definitely not the type to get paranoid when I'm stoned. So our sobriety, or lack thereof, is not an excuse for what happened. It was pretty windy that night, so all the trees around us were loudly swaying. Out of nowhere, the wind completely stopped, and the trees fell silent. Then the leaves on the trees that we were standing by, very slowly and eerily, fell to the ground, all at the same level and speed. We looked at each other, and kind of nervously laughed. Suddenly, we were both filled with this sense of impending doom, like something was telling us to leave the woods immediately. I know this, because my roommate told me that he felt the same way after the fact. We grabbed our weed and full-fledged sprinted out of the woods and down the steep hill. As I was running down the hill, I fell backwards really hard and messed up my elbow. To be honest, it almost felt like I was yanked back by something. But there's a definite possibility that I just slipped on the dirt and fell because we were flying down this essentially vertical hill. I picked myself up and we ran into our dorm building, slamming the door behind us. After that, my roommate refused to go into those woods to smoke for the rest of the year. There were a few times where I went back up that hill and into those woods by myself to smoke. I didn't feel like walking across campus to go to another spot. For the most part, I was fine, and I did not experience anything. But there were a few other times when I would wind up there around midnight, and I would suddenly be filled with the same sense of impending doom, telling me to leave those woods. I haven't gone back to that area since, but I can still see the eerie way that those leaves fell around us. I was going on a camping trip with my friend Jess, her boyfriend Victor, and his friend Chris. It was late last summer a few years ago. I had known Jess for a few years at that point, and I had met her boyfriend a few times, maybe 5 times. I didn't know Chris at all, but I was excited for the trip anyways. I'm not much of an outdoors type person. I'm in good shape though, so I knew I could handle the hike. It was just the sleeping on the ground part that worried me a bit. The other 3 members of the group had more experience with trips like this though. They picked me up early in the morning in Victor's truck. I threw my bag in the back and jumped in where Jess and the others were. We lived in the city, so it would be a few hours on the road before we got to the trail. Our trip would be 3 nights, with each night at a different site. We would hike in and set up at one of a few sites that we would find on the way. It was the busy time of the year, but the trail was fairly remote and too difficult for most people, so we were pretty sure that there would be room for us. We parked the car at the small parking lot of the trailhead. We weren't the only ones there. There were a few other cars. We got out and hit the trail. As we trekked deeper into the woods, our laughter echoed for miles. We had been hiking for a few hours before we saw another person. Approaching us on the path was a single woman. As she got close, we moved aside so she could get by on the narrow trail. When she passed us, we could tell that her eyes were red and swollen. It was as if she had been crying. Her appearance gave away her distress, but we hesitated to ask. Our group exchanged uneasy glances, but we ultimately decided to mind our own business and continued on our way. The woman disappeared behind us. Upon reaching our first campsite, we set up and built a fire. We still had a few hours of light, but we decided to stop because we weren't sure how long it would take us to get to the next site. We also didn't know if it would be as good as this one. There was plenty of room for our tents, and a decent amount of firewood to be found. Jess and I were sitting around the fire, while Victor and Chris went exploring. The sun was setting when they came back. When they approached us, we could tell that something was wrong. Victor told us that they found something. They led us a short distance into the woods and pointed. Tucked away in the bushes was the remnants of a tent, as if it had been hastily abandoned. It wasn't ripped or faded or anything. The bright orange fabric looked almost new. It was rolled up in a ball and stuffed behind a bush, like a careless attempt to hide it. It made no sense. None of us touched the thing. We figured that since it wasn't ours, we should leave it. Chris thought someone was coming back for it, but that didn't make any sense to me. It was out there exposed to the elements. It would be ruined by rain in no time out there. I let it go though, and we went back to our site. We continued the trip and didn't worry about the tent or the woman the whole time. The following 2 nights passed without incident. We made it back in one piece. As we emerged from the wilderness and back into civilization, the familiar sights and sounds of the town greeted us. It was fun being out there, but I was happy to be back. The next day, I got a call from Jess. She heard on the news that a man had gone missing in the area where we were camping. The details were chillingly familiar. The missing hiker's name was Mark, and his girlfriend was named Lily. She was the prime suspect in his disappearance. The news sent shivers down my spine as I recalled the young woman we had encountered on the trail. An unsettling suspicion gnawed at the back of my mind. Could that distraught woman have been Lily? The pieces of the puzzle seemed to align. We contacted the police and told them what we knew. We told them about the woman on the trail and did our best to describe her. It was hard though. We told them about the tent in the bushes because we thought that might be connected to the case in some way. The police searched the area for days, but a body was never found. I hoped that meant it was a misunderstanding, but that's not likely the case. I found out then that a body in the woods does not often last long. Animals are quick to tear it apart. It's exceedingly rare to find an intact body in the woods after more than a few days. To think that something so horrific was happening out there while we were relaxing and enjoying nature is something that will always stay with me. I felt guilty for a while, even though I know it was not my fault. As far as I know, the case is still unsolved, and it's still chilling to this day.